RC.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Your mic is so sonorous. It's nice.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable what a difference it makes.
It does. Is Joby here yet?
I don't see her yet.
So we should just mute and stop our video whenever we're not talking. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. What I would recommend is we maybe can all be on video when Emily makes the introduction and
Yeah.
then turn off.
And then as soon as I start my section, you guys will just turn yourselves off.
Thank you for the promotion. Good afternoon, everybody. So it's 12:30. I think we will get started. So thanks so much for joining us today for the Founding Fathers and Revolutionary Women program presented by the Rosenbach. My name is Emily Parker. I am the Director of Education at the Rosenbach, and I am delighted to be your MC for today's program. For some of you, you may not have actually been to the Rosenbach before, so we thought that we would start today's program by sharing a little bit about who we are, what we have, what we do, and then some upcoming programs that you might be interested in. So the picture that we're looking at right now on your screen is a picture of Abraham Rosenbach's library, his private library, which is now part of the museum. This is an exterior shot of the museum. It was the historic townhome of both Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach as well as his brother Philip, and they were rare book and manuscript dealers. Their home opened as a library at a museum in 1854, and our sort of core collections consist of American history, British, continental European history and literature, as well as fine and decorative art. So I wanted to call your attention just to some programs that we've done in the past, as well as some upcoming programs. So today we are focused on Founding Fathers and Revolutionary Women, but our programs are really wide-ranging in terms of what we offer. And we have shifted basically everything that we do. We've shifted it from an in-person platform to a virtual platform. So if you visit the website down on the bottom of your screen, you can find all of our different virtual resources, virtual programs that are coming up. But some examples of programs that we've had in the past, we've covered topics like 20th century lesbian and gay lives. We have an amazing Emily Dickinson collection. We focused on Indigenous authors and activists, and a program that we did just last week was called In Bed with Ishmael, Queer Approaches to Herman Melville, related to an exhibition that we have on Herman Melville. And finally, a program that's coming up this Friday about a woman named Alice Dunbar Nelson. Really, really amazing activist, artist, writer. So this program is going to be presented by one of the organizers of the exhibition, Alex Ames. So it's a free program. You can register for it on our website, and so that you get the link to participate, and we'd really love to see you there. And before we get to our program, just a little shout out about donations. We are so pleased to be able to present programs like this for free, virtual programs like this for free. But to allow us to continue to do that kind of thing, we would be so grateful if you might consider donating. Even a small donation is helpful. So the link right there on your screen is where you can do that. So now I am pleased to introduce Judy Gustin, our Director of Collections, who is going to be talking about Founding Fathers, complicating the story of national icons like Jefferson, Washington, and Adams.
Thanks so much, Emily. It's so great to be here with you today, and I thank you all for attending this program in the lead up to the celebration of our nation's founding, and our founding fathers are a big part of that. So I'm happy to be able to talk about them and hopefully to shed some new light for you on their stories. In this section, if you could give me the next slide, Emily, that would be really helpful. Thanks. So in this section, we're going to start with the youngest of the three founders we'll discuss today, and our third president, and perhaps as a way of jumping off the interpretive deep end, the most complicated of the three, Thomas Jefferson. If any of you have visited us at the Rosenbach for our Behind the Bookcase hands-on tours, in particular our Founding Fathers tour, we take turns reading from our founders' manuscripts to better understand the men most of us grew up with thinking of as icons. Their personal writing helps us see them in more human situations, in moments that define them in their youth, in despair as parents of a child, in the thrall of intellectual discovery, or even in a fit of anger. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. In one section of this tour that I like to call So You Want to Found a Nation, we ask ourselves, who did these icons think they were going to be before they became who they actually ended up being? For Jefferson, we can find that answer in two letters in our collection. You see the first of those two letters here on the right-hand side. So Jefferson here is writing to a friend of his, Will Fleming, when he was only 20 years old. And in it, he proposes a plan. They will marry two beautiful girls, and I put the word girls in quotes because they would never at that time have called them women. They're going to live next door to each other in the country. They'll practice law together, and they're going to drive a really hot sports carriage. So how did this plan turn out? And what happened to Jefferson next? So the second letter, for which I'm sorry I don't have a picture because we haven't been able to access our collections on site yet, and I just don't have that picture, but I'll tell you what it's about. Jefferson writes to Will about 5 months later. And by this time, the girl that Jefferson was supposed to marry has wed another man. But he tells Will that that's okay. He should go ahead and marry his chosen girl. Jefferson has decided to remain single. Why is that? Williamsburg, then the colonial capital, holds much for a single man. What does this mean? Well, a few things have happened. We know that he spent much of his first year reading the law, meaning going to law school, at William and Mary, frivolously partying. But he became more studious in his second year, finding intellectual mentors, reading European philosophy, and listening to arguments at coffee houses and in the House of Burgesses about British taxation and the colonists' response in the lead up to the coming revolution. Thus began the radicalization of young Thomas Jefferson. Can I have the next slide? So it would look like Jefferson was building the resume of a radical from law school onward. In the 1760s and 70s, he took on 7 cases representing enslaved persons seeking their freedom, some of them pro bono, using the argument of natural rights of freedom of the sort that we are all given by our Creator. This should sound familiar to you from some important American documents. These cases did not go particularly well. In 1776, he was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. In his draft, he wrote a clause blaming King George for bringing slavery to the colonies, stating, quote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery," end quote. It was dropped due to its offensiveness to the southern colonies and northern slave traders. In Virginia in 1778, he offered a law prohibiting the importation of enslaved Africans. It was rejected. In 1784, he proposed that the United States ban slavery in the Northwest Territory, which had been ceded by Great Britain in 1783. This was rejected, but was approved 3 years later as a law with Jefferson's name on it. In 1785, in writing his only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he suggested a plan of gradual emancipation for enslaved people. His text clearly shows, however, that he considered Blacks inferior to whites. In 1788, in private correspondence noted here, he noted his desire for abolition saying, "Nobody wishes more ardently to see an abolition not only of the trade, but of the condition of slavery. And certainly, this is important here, nobody will be more willing to encounter every sacrifice for that object." Can I have the next slide? In 1789, Jefferson was minister to France. He missed out on the opportunity to contribute to the Constitution and Bill of Rights as they are written and ratified. In this letter written from Paris to his friend David Humphreys, he comments on the Bill of Rights shortly before it was approved in its final form. And he lists in this letter those he'd liked included specifically as the rights of thinking and publishing our thoughts by speaking or writing, the right of free commerce, the right of personal freedom, again, that natural right that we were talking about before, trial by jury, limitations on government from keeping a standing army, and term limits for the presidency. Can I have the next slide? But who were these rights for? Despite his intellectual arguments against slavery, Jefferson was himself a lifelong holder of enslaved persons on his own properties. Here are several pages in his hand showing the names of people he enslaved to work for him. First, we see here family groupings. Those are on the left-hand side of each of these pages, and textiles distributed to them from which they made clothing and bedding for themselves. Can I have the next slide? This is 1811, after Jefferson's presidency and in his retirement, partly spent on his farm at Poplar Forest, which was subdivided into smaller units called plantations. These two are named Bear Creek and Tomahawk. You can see those names at the top of each of these sides of the same piece of paper. We see family groups again, this time listed by their names and birth years. So you'll see at the top of each of these groupings, two smaller dates, and then their children have somewhat larger dates because they're born later. And those are the listings here by name and by which plantation they were on. So those are the groupings seen here. I'll leave you to ponder the dichotomy we've just seen in Jefferson. Some people would call it hypocrisy. But I'll also give you some other information. Research shows that of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, about 75% were slaveholders sometime during their lifetimes. North and South, House and Field. This is not to excuse or normalize the practice at all. It's just a reminder of how embedded this practice was in our nation's birth. We'll have an opportunity to discuss this further in the Q&A at the end of this section, so feel welcome to add your questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll get back to them as soon as we look at the other two founders in this section. Now we'll move on to George Washington, the oldest of our three founders and our first president. So can I have the next slide, please? Can I have the next slide? Thanks. So George Washington, as you know, was our first president and often referred to as the father of our country. He lost his own father at a young age. He inherited land and several people enslaved working on that property at the time of his inheritance. Lacking formal education, he learned surveying and went to work as a very young man in his teens, taking on a military career, marrying into a wealthy family, and landing in politics, all prior to the 1765 Stamp Act that sort of started the revolution in motion. Although he never had biological children, he had a larger family who depended on him as a father figure. Can I have the next slide, please? Here he writes to his sister on her daughter, so his nieces, pending engagement, of which he expresses disapproval. He says that since she has little fortune herself, she has no right to expect much from a potential husband. But at least she should have, at least he, the potential husband, should be proven to be respectable, and he, George Washington, will make inquiries as to that. He says he won't stand in the way of Harriet, the niece, of Harriet's affections, but wishes that she could have spent more time at Mount Vernon with him, where she might have been in better company and met a better match. This letter is called a retained copy or a draft that was kept in Washington's file. You can note that it's docketed. In other words, there's a note in the left-hand margin that says to whom it was written, Betty Lewis, George's sister, and the date. So you can see the horizontal folds. He would have folded it up and put this so that he would see the docketing information at the top, and he could have referred back to it from his file. So that gives us an opportunity to see all the crossouts, so that he would have written what's called a fair copy or a neater copy to send to his sister. But we see here how he might have struggled with some words in making a more polite copy. These might have been his original intentions, but he thought better of them, crossed them out, and in the fair copy, made it a little nicer to her. And we get to see what was originally on his mind as he wrote this. And we've got a number of Washington's original retained copies in our collection. So just to sum up, Washington won't stand in the way of his niece's emotional autonomy, but despite not offering to share any of his wealth with his family, he does think that his status can offer his female family members a way to better their social standing. So let's take a look at John Adams, the middle figure in our group today. Can I have the next slide? So we'll look at Adams, and he's definitely the crankiest of the group, and we'll also take a look at his role as a father today. Could I have the next slide? So usually he addressed his children individually in his letters home when he was traveling. And you can see here he's traveling in Philadelphia in 1777. But he didn't know when he wrote this, in his absence, that young Thomas, who was then 5, had learned to read. Abigail corrected him and provoked his writing of this letter. And in this letter to Thomas as an individual, he tells him, he asked Thomas to tell him how many chickens, ducks, and geese are raising and how the garden looks. It's very sweet, actually. Whereas we have no other family letters, and most of the letters, all the rest of the letters in our collection are political. All of them are terribly vitriolic, focusing on his political life, his dislike for his colleagues, and how much he really hates the vice presidency when he's in it, and his sense of being underappreciated by everyone. To give you an example of his usual vitriol, a letter from our collection from 1812 that was written in the wake of a press interview that he thought was going to be about him, but which turned out to be another writer wanting to know more about his relationship with George Washington, reads as follows. The rushing and dashing and roaring of the word Washington, 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 like the waters at Passaic or the more tremendous cataract of Niagara, deafens, stuns, astonishes, and bedizzards all who are within hearing. Both parties are equally bewildered in this folly. They make of the name Washington, of his opinions, principles, system, and examples, exactly what they had heretofore made of the word republicanism. That is to say, anything, everything, and nothing. So, can I have the next slide? With that, we offer you 2 questions about looking at manuscripts. Why is it helpful for Americans to be able to read private letters from public figures like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson? And what can we learn from historic documents that may never have been intended for public viewing? Those are just 2 questions to get you thinking, but we're certainly happy to have you, and I see some people have added comments and questions in the chat box. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily, who's going to help us sort through those, and we're happy to answer your questions and look at your thoughts today. And thank you again for sharing this day with us, and we'll get to questions and comments now. Emily, do you want to join us and help us sort through the questions? Well, I'm happy to start. Let's see. I see that some of you have had trouble hearing me. I'm very sorry for that. Some people haven't. So there's a lot of comments about hearing. I'm so sorry for those of you who didn't have a good time hearing.
So as Judy said, please feel free to write your comments, your questions, your answers in the chat box. So Jason Downs asks, what are your personal feelings towards these three men? And what have you learned from their personal letters?
Well, thank you, Jason. I feel rather attached to all of them. Sometimes I get angry at them, but they really do, having all of their personal information certainly brings them to life, and it makes me feel like we gain a lot from having the insights that we get from seeing their personal letters. They are definitely more human, and they're much more fallible. We often hear people's frustration with people like Jefferson because of their obvious hypocrisy, but we see their fallibility in every part of their lives when we see their personal documents, and we understand them more as regular people, just like we are. And I think that's very helpful in understanding that their greatness seems somewhat greater because we understand how normal they are, just like us, and how fallible and how human. And so I think you see that whole spectrum in them, and it makes it seem really quite remarkable that they created some of the documents that they fought for the freedom of a nation, and yet they were, in the end, as as human as we are. That's pretty much how I feel about them across the spectrum. I mean, I see the struggle that John Adams went through. He did some things that I don't appreciate at all, and yet how much he really felt for this country and its ability to be great. And so you really have to both cheer for them and in some instances really feel disappointed by them. So you end up having this love-hate relationship with them. And yet every time I look at these documents, I appreciate so much the fact that our founders collected them, because they give you this ability to have this insight into their lives, into their family lives, and into the way that they were able to create a nation that also some of us particularly now can have kind of a love-hate relationship with too. We love it and we want it to succeed, and yet sometimes we just get so angry. So I think it's how do you feel about your country some days, right? I think we can feel the same way about them. So thank you for your question. I really
appreciate it. Judy, thank you. So we're getting a lot of really great comments here. Okay. So Bruce says that primary sources bring history alive. Leah Beck, it's a name that I recognize as a teacher that I've worked with. And Leah asked about teaching American literature. What would you suggest in terms of primary source documents to help high schoolers understand these men? Leah, we've actually got a whole bunch of resources on our website right now that we created to help parents who were teaching their kids at home, parents and caregivers who were teaching their kids at home. So I'd invite you to go check out that page, because there's a lot of lessons related to American history. And James says that he's mostly interested in the public persons because there's so much more context for them. Without a whole lot of verifiable context, what does the personal information in quotes mean? And then Peggy says, did anyone ever decide why the contradiction about Jefferson's, attitudes towards slaves?
There's so much writing on that, and I would really refer you to a lot of books that have been written on that, and I'm not sure that anyone gets to make a decision. I think that's all about of argumentation. There are so many great books, and I think after this we send out emails to all of you, and we might refer you to some books that have been written about, some great biographies that have been written about Jefferson. I'm not sure that it's easy to come down as to why that contradiction is there. And I would encourage you to do more reading about Jefferson and get to know him more, and try to come to a conclusion yourself until you feel satisfied with why that is. It's really hard. And if I had a time machine, I would go back and try to meet him. I have no idea. I just like to keep reading, and I would encourage you to do the same.
And Joan asks, at this moment in time, do you feel the need to re-examine their relation to slavery in a more serious way? And then there are a couple questions about the letters and if they give us any more information about Jefferson's relationship with Sally, his slave.
Okay, that's a good question. Let's start with the ones about Sally Hemings. We don't have in our collection any information about Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. In the list that I showed you of the enslaved people on Jefferson's properties, there are a number of people named Sally, but those lists do not refer to Monticello, where Sally Hemings and her family lived. So those are different Sallys. So we don't have anything that refers directly to her, so no further information there. There's been a lot of work done on the Hemings family at Monticello, and a lot of work around that whole family. So I would encourage you to look at the website for Monticello. There's more information there, and there also have been some books written about Jefferson's relationship with the Hemings family and with Sally in particular. So we might refer you to those two in a future email. So I'm sorry we can't offer any additional information there from our own collections. But it's certainly been very interesting and something that's been more and more researched in recent years, and should have been and still should continue to be. And should we do more serious research? It's ongoing, yes, and certainly is something that we should acknowledge as we have here with the materials that we see. The materials that we have here are things that we would love for scholars to come to our reading room and take a look at. I think that there's a lot there, even though those are the few things that we have that show a relationship between Jefferson and his enslaved populations on his properties. I think there's a lot to be looked at there. Very sort of small details of those materials that I think researchers could look at. And we would love for people who are interested in that topic to come and look at them. But the larger issue is something that is ongoing in the academic population and among writers. We are happy to make our materials available. Yes, this is something that we definitely encourage here, and we like to present this topic, and we have both in exhibitions and talks like this one been very open about the fact. We don't try to hide the fact that, that we know this information about Jefferson at all. I hope that answers your question, but thank you for it, by the way.
And Peggy writes, was Sally Hemings educated?
That's a good question. I am not an expert on Sally Hemings. My understanding is that, I really can't claim to know anything about how she might have been educated while she was enslaved on Jefferson's property at Monticello. So I really can't tell you much more than that I don't know too much. You may want to refer again to the Monticello website. And certainly do ask them what they know that's up to date about her life there. And she did, I know, travel with Jefferson to France. So you may want to know more about that and what, her life there was like. Probably, they would be the best resource for information specifically about Sally, as well as books that have been published on her life with him.
And a couple of really interesting questions and comments. So Jason writes, recently many of us have been asking deeper questions about the morals of our historical icons. Is there any value to idolatry, or do you think it's generally a bad idea? And before you try to answer that, Judy, there also is a comment just about the term relationship that was used in terms of Hemmings and Jefferson, and whether that's really the kind of the right term to use, or whether a more accurate term would be that she actually serviced him rather than them having a relationship.
Right.
I don't think Judy necessarily need to comment on that, but it just was it was something that I wanted to make sure everyone heard.
Yeah, well, when I use the word relationship, I'm just talking about it in a very vague term. I'm not using it as to give any sense of, when we talk about like significant other or something like that. I was just using it in terms of I'm not really qualifying it in any way, as much as to say, whatever transpired between them is a sort of vague term, but I'll accept what you say as being appropriate in this instance for sure. That they had a human interaction that qualifies on the end of the spectrum you're talking about. Yes. So yes. And what was the other question? I'm sorry, Emily, I'm not following along.
The idolatry question.
Yeah.
Whether there's any value in idolatry, or is it just generally a bad idea?
Oh yeah, and I would say that, and that's why we want to be looking at these kinds of materials within collections that museums and libraries hold, to make sure that we're not turning people into simply icons, but we're looking at them as human beings who are fallible. And we also need to make sure that we're maintaining that kind of humility ourselves as we approach them, that we don't use our stance in this day and age to say we have achieved any kind of perfection as we look at them. We too are in that position as fallible human beings looking at other fallible human beings. I would always take that stance that we need to curators are not perfect either, as we look at other people from the past who are also imperfect human beings.
Great. And I think so that we can move on with other topics, we'll go on in just a moment, but I did want to address a question from someone, and now I'm not finding it, but they were wondering, wow, it's way up here, that if we actually have records of where we purchased these letters, how much we paid, and the sort of provenance information. Do we have those records?
Sometimes yes, and just to give you a sense that these come from different sources. Many of these were purchased by Dr. Rosenbach himself. Sometimes they are purchased individually. And in that case, we would more likely know how much each of them would have cost at the time. Sometimes they're purchased together with other objects in lots. And so in that case, we would know often what the whole lot cost. But most often for these kinds of manuscripts, we would know what its provenance is, and where it, where it came from, and what the cost was at the time. For the most part, yes, I would say yes.
Great, thank you. And just an apology to everybody, right at the start of this program, my speaker stopped working. So I wasn't really able to hear Judy as well. And so that's why there were some delays in terms of me forwarding the slide for her. But now I've got these fancy headphones on, and so I can hear everybody loud and clear. So I think we'll move on. Judy, if you're ready, we'll move on to our next section.
Just thank you everyone for your questions, and we will send you some resources after this this program. Thank you.
So our next section is part 2, Revolutionary Women, specifically Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley. So I am happy to introduce our next panelist, Judy Gustin, who is the Rosenbach's registrar. Judy can maybe say a little bit more about what a registrar does, but it's a job at a museum that not that many people know about, but she basically is the sort of record keeper of the institution and tracks loans and really everything related to our collections and documenting them. So Joby, maybe you can say a little bit more. I'm not so good at explaining that.
Absolutely. First, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so a registrar is basically the keeper of the stuff and the things, the record keeper. And so as we look at this picture of the West Library, it's basically my job to know where every book on that shelf is, and that it's actually there when it's supposed to be there. And I also handle all of the loans that come in to the museum to enhance our exhibitions. And then I also am responsible for bringing loans out of the museum. So when other institutions want to borrow something from our rich holdings, I'm the one who technically lets it out of the building. And I'm happy to talk more about registration at another point if anyone has any questions. It's definitely a behind the scenes job. And that's actually my comfort zone. So it's really funny to be in front of the camera since I'm usually tucked away in my office with files. But anyway, I'm going to speak about the Revolutionary Women, Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley. These two women are actually revolutionary from a literary standpoint. Bradstreet was the first woman published in the American colonies, and Wheatley is the first African-American poet published. Neither woman had an easy life, and many of their personal, spiritual, and ideological conflicts are reflected in their writing. So I'm going to be a little bit more biographical about my people since they're less known. So Anne Bradstreet, or actually Anne Dudley, was born in 1612 in England. She had no formal education, but she was taught to read by her father, who was a steward to an estate. And this actually afforded Anne access to the rich library of volumes of people like Virgil and Plutarch, and then more contemporary authors like Milton and Raleigh. In 1628, Anne married Simon Bradstreet. She was just 16 at the time, and the couple remained married until her death in 1672. Though Anne was ambivalent to the ideas of Puritan salvation and redemption, she came to the New World with her parents and her husband and many Puritans, landing in Salem, Massachusetts in 1630. She had given up the comforts of estate living, and life in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was quite challenging. Many of the settlers who had come the year before did not survive the harsh winter, and those that did were either sick or weak with hunger. So faced with poor housing, scarce food, and tense diplomatic relations with existing populations, the family shortly moved. But Anne herself could not escape these harsh realities. Her earliest extant poem, Upon a Fit of Sickness, from 1632, remarks on the shortness of life, the certainty of death, and her hope of salvation. I think next slide, Emily. So though her domain was domestic, Anne's identity was actually a reflection of her father and her husband, whose excellencies and ideals in the interconnected realms of church and state were gaining power and respect in the colony. And the testimonial page of her book positions Anne as a pious, diligent Puritan woman who neither abandoned her family of 8 children nor her household duties in order to write. The circumstances surrounding the publication of the book are ambiguous. Some sources claim that her brother-in-law, John Woodbridge, either secretly compiled or stole her poetry and then brought them to London, where they were published in 1650 as the 10th Muse. 10th Muse lately sprung up in America, and actually the title goes on for quite some time. You can read it right there on the slide. And this book contains poems that she wrote between 1635 and 1645. And regardless of the circumstances surrounding its publication, Anne Bradstreet was the first published writer in North American colonies. So next slide, Emily. So why London? Why do you think the book was published in London? And why do you think the book was titled The 10th Muse? If you want to put some answers into the chat box, we'll talk about this just briefly because we got more to go through. But figured I'd ask and see so we can have some audience participation.
So Leah says that London had already published women at this point, she thinks. And then Peggy says that she believes there were 9 Greek muses.
Yes. So yes, they were 9 Greek muses, all the daughters of Zeus, and they're the goddesses and embodiments of science, literature, and the arts. And then London was certainly the publishing, I'm going to say, hotspot of the day. Although movable type was invented in 1450, printing presses were not exactly common in the mid-17th century. And while there was one printing press in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, on which the Baysom book, the first book printed in the colonies, was printed, and the Rosenbach does have one of 11 existing copies of that book. In London, there were at least 20 licensed presses and probably hundreds of unlicensed presses. And they were definitely printing, in addition to broadsides or single-sided posters and pamphlets, they were printing newspapers and books. So a woman printing poetry would certainly have a greater chance to print and have her work published in England than she certainly wouldn't even have that opportunity in the colonies. So thank you for those answers. Whether it was Anne or her brother-in-law who so whether it was Anne or her brother-in-law who did so, calling the book The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America is a bold, targeted jab to England, that this muse is here in the colonies. However, Bradstreet herself was apologetic and self-critical of her work, not measuring up to the greatness of classic poets. And the final couplet in the opening stanza of Prologue, the first poem in the book, ends, "Let poets and historians set these forth, my obscure lines shall not dim their worth." Her poems generally reflect a true internal conflict that she feels as experiencing it both as a woman writer and as a Puritan. There's this constant tension between sin and redemption, physical and emotional frailty, death and immortality, sensory pleasures and the promise of heaven, and most poignantly, the connections that she feels personally with her children and her husband, and then her relationship with God. Anne didn't express any of her radical thoughts publicly. She knew and learned from Anne Hutchinson, whose public expression of strong anti-Puritan beliefs just a decade earlier led to her banishment from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. May I have the next slide?
Joby, before you go to the next slide, Mary Ann just mentioned, has an answer to the why does she think the book was published in London and not Massachusetts. She mentions that paper manufacturing was in its infancy in the colony, and any paper made or imported was probably needed for official documents.
That sounds quite reasonable. Certainly important documents first, women way down the list of things that get priorities on the printing press in the colonies. So here we have excerpts from In Honor of That High and Mighty Princess, Queen Elizabeth. And it's a very humorous and surprisingly feminist poem. Though Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, 9 years before Anne was even born, her influence was still felt strongly, particularly by women. And this is Bradstreet drives this home in the final couplets of both of these stanzas, that hath wiped off the aspersions of her sex, that women wisdom lack to play the wrecks. And then on the other side, let such as say our sex is void of reason, no, 'tis a slander now, but once was treason. Her poem, A Dialogue Between Old England and New, was indeed written for a public audience, and it's written in the form of a conversation between a mother and daughter, and it's both playful and barbed. And by contrast, her poems about the expectation of motherhood, the grief of losing a child, and even the devastation of a home being burned by fire are very poignant and touching. The physical and emotional love that she feels for her husband is abundantly evident in a poem called A Letter to Her Husband Upon Absent Upon Public Employment. And these personal poems, which were never intended for public viewing beyond the family, show Bradstreet's true self, and including her questioning of Puritan beliefs. But by the end of her life, when she writes the poem Contemplations, you can see an evolution in her style of writing, and also a reflection of her true feelings of content and happiness and religious reckoning. For Bradstreet, heaven is not a place of salvation. It is having a prolonged and fulfilling life on earth. And while Anne Bradstreet probably did not see herself as a revolutionary poet, but as a woman reflecting on the world as she experienced it. The fact that the poems were published at all is truly revolutionary. And then the second edition of the 10th Muse would be published 2 years after her death in 1678. And it included some corrections and amendments to those original poems, and then a number of previously unpublished poems. Can I have the next slide? So the second revolutionary woman that I'm going to talk about is Phyllis Wheatley, though we do not know what her actual name was. She was likely born in Senegambia in West Africa circa 1753, and she was taken by force and brought to Boston in 1761 when she was about 8 years old. Her first name, Phyllis, may be derived from the ship she was aboard. She was purchased by John Wheatley, a successful Boston tailor, as a present for his wife, Susanna, and given their last name. Phyllis displayed an obvious intelligence, which was considered an anomaly for an African. She was taught to read and write, though she was not excused from her domestic chores. She also mastered Latin and became familiar with ancient history, mythology, and literature. Her first published poem was On Monsieur's Hussy and Coffin, and it was inspired by a true story of survival at sea. And it was printed in Newport, Rhode Island in 1767. Phyllis was just 13 years of age when she wrote it, and it dates actually just a couple of years after that first letter from Jefferson that Judy read earlier. The Wheatleys introduced Phyllis to elite members of Boston society as an exception to the general belief that Africans were less intelligent to the white Eurocentric populations. And though she definitely engaged in conversation about classic literature and history, she was probably seen as an exotic curiosity. However, Phyllis here recognized her audience. Her future poems demonstrate Euro-American traditions, the clear influence of neoclassicism, and also reflected the Wheatleys' personal values. The first poem that garners Phyllis any recognition is an elegiac poem on the death of that celebrated divine and eminent servant of Jesus Christ, the Reverend and learned George Whitefield. It was published as a broadside and in pamphlet form in Boston, Newport, and in Philadelphia in 1770, and then it was published as part of a funeral sermon for Whitefield in London in 1771, and this is what brought her some international attention. By 1772, Phyllis had amassed a collection of 28 poems that she wished to publish, and with Mrs. Wheatley's assistance, she advertised subscriptions in Boston newspapers. But the colonists would not financially support the literary pursuits of an enslaved African. Seemingly undeterred, Phyllis sought support in London from Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntington. Hastings was a wealthy supporter of evangelical and abolitionist causes, and the aforementioned Reverend Whitefield had been her personal chaplain. Wheatley wrote to Hastings apologizing for her boldness in addressing her ladyship directly and humbling herself as an untutored African. Hastings was interested. Emily, can I get the next slide? So Wheatley traveled to London, and Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was published in 1773, a copy of which is in the Rosenbach collection. I apologize, these two pictures are not from our edition. The frontispiece on the previous slide was from ours. So this first book published by an African American in the colonies actually requires the testimony stating that an African could write this. And so on the side of your screen, you see 17 prominent white men of Boston, including John Hancock and Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver, James Bowdoin, and Reverend Mather Byles, stating that Phyllis is indeed the author. And of course, the book also includes the frontispiece with a portrait of Phyllis. So the Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, contains her most recognized poem on being brought from Africa to America. And in this poem, Wheatley does not portray Africa or being Black with a kind eye. And she instead plays to the propriety of white Christians to do the right thing and to accept Africans. Philadelphia's Dr. Benjamin Rush was a supporter of her work, but Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was not. And in his notes on Virginia, he writes about Phyllis Wheatley. He writes, "Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it cannot produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism." Can I have the next slide? Well, look, here we have her poem. So Phyllis's stay in London did not last long. She returned to attend to the ill Susanna, and just a few months before Susanna died in 1774, Phyllis was manumitted. And although she was free, she remained in the Wheatley's home. It does appear, however, that she felt less restricted to discuss her true feelings towards slavery after she was granted freedom. May I have the next slide? While Wheatley was a strong supporter of the colony's fight for independence, she expresses some frustration during the beginning stages of the American Revolution, particularly the hypocrisy of embracing the rhetoric of liberty and freedom while enslaving others. And in this letter, written to Reverend Sansom Occam, who is an ordained Presbyterian minister and a member of the Mohegan tribe, Wheatley writes in 1774, and think highly reasonable what you offer in vindication of their natural rights. Those that invade them cannot be insensible that the divine light is chasing away the thick darkness which broods over the land of Africa, and the chaos which has reigned so long is converting into beautiful order and reveals more and more clearly the glorious dispensation of civil and religious liberty, which are so inseparably limited that there is little or no enjoyment of one without the other. However, actually, if we can go back, Wheatley writes a poem called His Excellency George Washington, and in that poem, she praises his honor, gallantry, valor, and virtues, but does not make any mention of his hypocrisy of enslaving people. Presumably, the unspoken parallel issue would be evident to the general. She sent the poem along with the letter, which is listed over here. She sent this directly to Washington in 1775, and Washington wrote back and expressed that he enjoyed the poem. Alex is going to speak about who publishes the poem, His Excellency General Washington, in 1776. So I mentioned that Phyllis had been manumitted in 1774, but remained in the Wheatley home. When John Wheatley died in 1778, Phyllis was on her own for the very first time. And that year, she married a free African by the name of John Peters. And Wheatley and Peters had a difficult marriage. Peters held a variety of jobs, ranging from grocery store owner, lawyer, doctor, banker, barber. And it's not so much that he couldn't hold a job, or that he wanted to have so many jobs, but he had difficulty as a free Black man finding employment while competing against white men during the Revolutionary War. And Phyllis would be working as a maid during this time, but she was also sick and weak. And the couple had 3 children, but they all died in infancy. The nieces of John and Susanna Wheatley tried to help Phyllis during these times of hardship and illness. And Phyllis continued to write poems and tried to publish a second book in 1779. But once again, she did not find the financial support that she needed. One of the final poems that was published in 1784 is To Mr. and Mrs. on the death of their infant son, and it's believed to be a lamentation on the death of her own child. Phyllis would die in December that same year at the age of about 30, possibly from complications from that childbirth. So her second book would actually be published again posthumously after her death 2 years later. And that's, if I can have the final slide, the sad story of Phyllis Wheatley, but truly a revolutionary from a literary standpoint. So if anyone wanted to answer some of these questions, in what ways were Anne and Phyllis's poems similar or different? Or how do you think the frontispiece was accepted by the public? I'm also open to other questions, but I will say I'm not really a poet by nature, so don't ask me about rhyme.
So as before, if you have comments or questions, just put them in the chat box. And I just wanted to call out, Petrin was mentioning that he was having a bit of trouble with the audio for Joby. We're going to be moving to our next panelist pretty soon. So I'm guessing that the audio will be a little bit better when we move to Alex. So I apologize for that.
I apologize too.
So James asked, how far south did she travel in her lifetime?
I do not know the answer to that question. But when I find out the answer, I'll let you know.
Okay, I think for the sake of time, I think we're going to move on to our next panelist, Alex Ames, who is our collections engagement manager. And so he definitely wins the prize for the coolest title, I think. And so he kind of sort of straddles between programs and exhibitions and collections at the Rose and Bath, and is kind of a liaison between those 2 departments. So I am so pleased to introduce Alex, who will be talking to us about Mary Wollstonecraft, Helen Maria Williams, and their global revolutions.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. First off, let me ask, is my volume okay? Can everyone hear me pretty decently?
It sounds good to me.
Okay, good. Super. Any concerns, please do put them in the chat box and I can move my microphone a bit closer as well. I also want to thank Judy and Joby for your presentations, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of this conversation today to sort of close out the discussion of revolutionary women, which Joby had begun during her commentary. So very often when this time of year comes around, with Independence Day on the horizon, the sort of mental focus of many Americans goes sort of inward. You know, the founding of our nation, the struggle of the American Revolution, the Constitution and Bill of Rights, that story that we are so often taught about the foundation of the United States. One challenge of this is that it is hard to remember sometimes that, as a matter of fact, the American Revolution was one iteration of a truly global age of revolutions, when the political, cultural, and intellectual status quo began shifting around the Atlantic world at this time. And when I say Atlantic world, I mean all of those nations, empires, geographic regions that touched on the Atlantic Ocean and were sort of really integrally connected to each other. This, the American Revolution was sort of an early stage in a global era of profound political and cultural transformation. And I want to talk a little bit with you about the after effects of the American Revolution in terms of other revolutions, and also how the language of revolution began to be adopted and used in other social reform movements around this time. Emily, could you please advance slides for me? Thank you. So, as I mentioned, the American Revolution was not an isolated political incident. It was an early occurrence, an early stage in what is really best called an age of revolutions that impacted empires, nations, and people all over the world at this time. The American Revolution came to a close in 1783 with the revolution, with the Treaty of Paris, but other revolutions at this time were just getting started. So for example, the French Revolution, which is perhaps the best known sort of corollary to the American Revolution, stretched from 1789 to 1799. The Haitian Revolution began in 1791 and ended in 1804, and revolutions in Spanish America, in Latin America, ranged from 1810 to 1825. So it's really a good idea always to think about the American Revolution in this much broader global context. And while each of these different political incidents was shaped by local realities, local stresses, and the political situation on the ground in these individual places, it is also true that the language of the European Enlightenment and the dialogue of revolution did much to sort of provide a vocabulary for the political realities that were working themselves out in these various European empires that were beginning to come to grips with some of the economic, political, social, cultural, and racial and ethnic tensions that they faced. But it's not just geographic. That's not the only way that revolution as an idea and the Enlightenment found sort of fertile soil. This very vocabulary of revolution could find expression in other social reform movements. And two of those intersecting reform movements that we're going to talk about via some artifacts that we'll see shortly are emerging calls for women's rights, for greater civil rights for women, as well as a growing global abolition movement, anti-slavery movement that found especially early expression in Great Britain. Emily, could you please advance slides for me? Thank you. So that was a really big picture overview of what I sort of want to talk about with you today, but now we're going to zoom in a little bit, and I want to try to tell this story through the three artifacts that you see on the screen, two of which are owned by the Rosenbach, one of which is owned by the Library Company of Philadelphia, and we had these recently on exhibition in a small gallery show, which is why I have the photographs that you see here. So the three works that we are looking at were all published or performed in 1792. So let's just think about that year for a moment. 1792, as I mentioned, the American Revolution had already come to a close in 1783. The US Constitution was ratified in 1787. The US Bill of Rights ratified 1791. The French Revolution was well underway. And so clearly there was a lot in the air in the Euro-American world at this time. Well, look at the titles of these three works that you see on the screen. And I'll start left and work my way right. Look at how they have all used this idea of rights, universal rights in their titles. And we'll talk a bit more about what they each have to say. The work on the far left is by Thomas Paine, a name you may know, most famous for having authored the pamphlet Common Sense, which did so much to stir sentiment in support of the American Revolution. Well, the book or the pamphlet, I should say, that you're looking at here is called Rights of Man, Part the Second, published in London in 1792. It put forth in this work, Paine put forth the idea that if a government did not serve the interests of its people, the people had the right to overthrow the government. This was not a popular idea in Great Britain at the time. They had just, at least among the authorities, the sort of elite level politicians, the establishment in Great Britain, they had just lost their North American colonies. They were watching what was happening in France across the English Channel at this time. Any threat to stability was seen as an existential threat. Thomas Paine was tried in absentia for having authored and published this work and found guilty of treason. So the British authorities took this work very seriously. In the middle there, you see another very famous publication by a British philosopher and activist, Mary Wollstonecraft. This is a first Philadelphia edition of her Vindication of the Rights of Woman. You'll see it was published in Philadelphia in 1792. That was the year that this work was written, so it had immediate global implications. This is also a work, we'll talk more about it in a minute, grounded in ideas of rights and of human reason. But then on the far right of your screen, you see a manuscript or a handwritten document called The Rights of Woman. And this is a poem written by the famous Scottish poet Robert Burns. Now, Burns knew Mary Wollstonecraft, or at least knew her work. Scholars think that he also knew her personally, possibly. But in this poem, Burns, who was actually a noted egalitarian, sort of makes light of the idea of women having civil rights and having played sort of a role in the civic sphere. It's a satirical poem that Burns wrote to be performed by a famous actress on the London stage. And in this poem, Burns, long story short, says that he believes that women basically their only role in society was a domestic role, not a role in the public sphere. So what you see on the screen here are three works, all of which date to the same year, all of which make use of the language of universal rights, but have different things to say about it. Emily, could you please advance slides for me? So let's talk a little bit more about Mary Wollstonecraft and her vindication. She was a prominent philosopher, historian, and activist who lived from 1759 to 97. She was deeply influenced by rationalism, and it's important to understand that the Vindication is really a work advocating for educational opportunity for women. And what I've done now is I've pulled out quotes from each of these three different works written in 1792 that we just talked about, and I'm going to read them to you so we can get a sense of where these three different authors fall in terms of their understanding of how the idea of rights could be applied to different groups of people. So in Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, he talks about equality among the classes, but does point out, using biblical evidence, the idea that there is a distinction between sexes. So you'll hear him talk about the account of creation from the books of Moses in the Bible. The Mosaic account of the creation, whether taken as divine authority or merely historical, is fully up to this point the unity or equality of man. The expressions admit of no controversy. The distinction of the sexes is pointed out, but no other distinction is even implied. So here we have a case of Thomas Paine embracing the idea of equality among the classes, so to speak, but not going so far as to fully endorse equality of the sexes in quite the same way. Then you see a verse from Robert Burns' poem, The Rights of Woman, in which, again, bear in mind, this is intended to sort of be funny to his audience. And so you can hear and see how he uses words that are invoking the political realities of the day, and then talking about how the discussion was also being raised about the rights of women. Then truce with kings and truce with constitutions, with bloody armaments and revolutions. Let majesty your first attention summon. Ah, sa ira, the majesty of woman. You'll note that he uses a couple of French words in this verse, and those would actually have been quite familiar to listeners to this poem at the time, because they were drawn from a well-known French revolutionary sort of patriotic anthem. So Burns goes on in this poem to say that women, as I mentioned earlier, sort of had domestic rights. And the three rights that Burns outlines in his satirical poem on this issue were the rights of protection, decorum, and admiration. That, putting forward the idea that unlike someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, who is arguing for true equality, Burns is essentially suggesting that gendered spheres should exist. Emily, could you please advance slides? So let's see what Mary Wollstonecraft has to say about this issue. So I'm going to read you now a quote from the Vindication. Contending for the rights of woman, my main argument is built on this simple principle, that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge, for truth must be common to all. And I think that that's such a powerful passage because it shows how this idea, this concept of both universal rights and the sort of supremacy of reason and truth were really essential to the arguments that were being put forward here. And this certainly isn't to contend that only out of Enlightenment and rationalist, language and thought could these ideas for equality emerge, but rather it did provide something of a vocabulary that some activists were able to use in the political milieu of this day. Next slide, please. I have two images here that show sort of, we're honing in on Robert Burns a little bit here, both the assumption or an idea for women's spheres that people like Robert Burns sometimes put forward in their romantic poetry, and the actual political reality on the ground by the end of the 1700s. On the left of your screen, you see an image from a much later copy or edition of various love poems from Scotland, that this is the sort of scene that someone like Robert Burns often would evoke in his poetry. The idea being, women as love objects of more powerful men. But the bottom line is, by the time Robert Burns wrote his poem, The Rights of Woman, he already, everyone in Europe at this time lived in a world where women had already begun, and successfully so, claiming civic space. So on the right of your screen, you see an image, a famous image of the Women's March on the Palace of Versailles from 1789, in which Parisian women took up arms and marched to demand political change. And so this was the reality by the time that Burns was writing his somewhat satirical poem. Next slide, please. Thank you. I want to introduce you to one other important revolutionary woman who is represented in the Rosenbach collection. You're looking here at an image of Helen Maria Williams, who lived from the mid-1700s through 1827. She has a lot in common with Mary Wollstonecraft. She was a British woman who lived in Paris during the French Revolution and even was imprisoned for a period of time. She hosted salons, or sort of intellectual gatherings at her home that were attended by Thomas Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft. She was very much a progressive. She wrote poetry about war, colonialism, and the practice of human enslavement, and also being critical of those things, and also wrote accounts of French life for British audiences. She also parlayed on equal terms with her fellow poet, Robert Burns, who had a reputation for not always taking women very seriously, but they did have an artistic sort of intellectual exchange. And you see here a letter from Williams to Burns. I'll read a quote from it to you. I want to show you that I have honesty enough to tell you what I take to be truths, even when they are not quite on the side of approbation. And I do it in the firm faith that you have equal greatness of mind to hear them with pleasure. So here you see her sort of claiming some agency in engaging with Robert Burns in a conversation on equal terms. Emily, could you please advance slides? That quote has to do with these two letters, which are at the Rosenbach. And I apologize, they're blurry images. I took these in a dim exhibition gallery, which is why you can't make they're sort of not crisp images. On the left, you have a critique of a poem by Williams, which Robert Burns wrote. So he offered some critiques on her work. And that's what you see on the left hand of your screen. It was a poem about her critique of the slave trade. And then on the right of your screen, you see her response. And that was the quote that I just read to you. Next screen, thank you. So now I want to invite you to look at two images here that you see on the screen. And if you wouldn't mind offering a few comments in the chat box about these two images. Both of these images represent, in their own way, something to do with revolution. On the left hand of your screen, you see an image that depicts important revolutionaries from the American Revolution who went on to become presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. This image dating to the early years of the 1800s. And then on the right hand of your screen, you see that picture that I showed you earlier depicting women marching to Versailles in Paris in 1789. Look at these images, and what do you think what story do they tell, and how do they tell that story differently in terms of how they're presenting the main actors in the image? So please take just a few moments, and if you wouldn't mind offering some comments in the chat, that would be great.
So Karen says that it looks like the women are working way harder than the men.
Yeah, I think that that's a pretty accurate summation of the difference of these images. I see some other comments coming in, so I'll mute myself.
Jan says that it's easy to see that when these images were created, the American men are already being glorified, their hard work is over, while the French women are doing the grunge work for the French Revolution. While the French women are doing the grunge work for the French Revolution. And Peggy says they both represent reality, different for men and for women. And Paula says that it seems like women were at the forefront in Paris, but behind the scenes in America.
So the reason, thank you all so much for sharing those comments. And I'll just quickly summarize why I wanted to present these two images side by side. And I think that you all sort of hit on the main point, which is that there's that old saying that history is often written by the people who win in an earlier period. And I think what we see in this image of these American presidents is it's a very conservative image. You know, it's presented in this, they're in sort of civilian clothing, they're presented as gentlemen, and it's seen sort of this intellectual endeavor. Whereas this image of the French Revolution, you have this sense of weaponry, it's active, it's motion driven. And of course, one of the realities is that for many people like Robert Burns, based on that poem that we explored together, this image of women being so deeply involved in and shaping the public sphere, the civic sphere, would have been threatening. And of course, when you look at this image of the American presidents, there's nothing very threatening about it. You'd think that they had always sort of been in charge. And I think that this does just go to show how different moments in history can have these sorts of different cultural resonances. And so it's really important to be able to read between the lines a little bit and look critically at images like this when we are interpreting. I see a comment, the left side is patriarchal. Yeah, I think that that's such a good point, that you know, it's presenting a sort of vision of you know, of American society that was very carefully crafted, and not necessarily, of course, as we all know, not representative of the highest ideals for which the American Revolution was fought in terms of universal rights. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Alex. Really a lot to take in, a lot of information, a lot of fantastic comments. I think we went We went way over time just because of all of your fantastic questions and comments. So thank you for those. So again, I wanted to just share a few resources that we have available at the Rosenbach. While we are closed to the public physically, there's just a wealth of information online. So 2 gallery gateways or virtual exhibitions that we have available to you that we thought would be interesting because they're related to the topics that we just covered, are the Out of Many One exhibition, as well as the Rights of Women, which connect to what Alex was talking about. Another thing that we have on available through our website are various different collections guides, so that you can explore collections in depth, as well as some object catalogs. And then there's many, many, many things that you're going to be able to do when we open back up to the public. So you could take a tour of the historic house, which you're looking at right in front of you. You could take a behind the bookcase program, make a research appointment to continue exploring the collection, and also become a member. And actually, you do not need to wait until we open to the public to become a member. As I mentioned at the start of this program, we are happy to provide these kinds of programs for free, but we also certainly welcome any donations that you are able to give, which will continue to allow us to offer programs like this for free. So in addition to making a donation today, we certainly welcome you to become a member of the Rosenbach to get all sorts of special content, programs, that type of thing. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I had mentioned briefly in the chat box that we will be sending out an email to all of the participants. So even if someone had to leave a little bit early, we will still be sending you all an email with resources, with our contact information. And also, we are live streaming this program so that we will be posting a video of it as well. So if you'd like to just watch it again, or if there's something that you missed, you are welcome to do that. So thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.